The wind howled across the small frontier train station, rattling the loose wooden boards and making the lantern above the platform swing back and forth. Snow fell heavily from the dark sky, piling along the edges of the tracks and covering the empty benches in a thin white layer. Emily Carter stood alone near the edge of the platform, hugging her arms tightly around herself. Her thin wool coat had been meant for autumn travel, not a brutal winter storm like this. Beneath it she still wore her pale nurse's uniform, the fabric stiff with cold and dust from the long journey she had already taken. She stared down the railroad tracks, hoping against reason to see the glow of the train's lantern returning. But the rails disappeared into darkness. She had missed it. Only an hour earlier, the train had thundered through the station, steam billowing into the icy air as passengers climbed aboard. Emily had arrived just in time to see the last carriage door slam shut and the conductor shout for departure. She had run toward the train, waving desperately, but the engine had already begun to move. Within seconds it was gone. The station master had tried to comfort her, explaining that the next train would not pass through until morning. He had offered a short apology before locking up his small office and hurrying home to escape the worsening storm. Now the entire station belonged to silence. Emily paced slowly across the wooden boards to keep her feet from going numb. The wind pushed snow across the platform in swirling waves, stinging her cheeks and making her eyes water. She tried to remain calm. She had not traveled all this way to lose hope now. In the pocket of her coat was a folded letter from the mining camp north of the territory. Their doctor had written urgently, explaining that a dangerous fever had begun spreading among the workers and their families. Several children had already fallen ill, and the small clinic had no trained nurse to help care for the growing number of patients. Emily had volunteered immediately. Helping people in need was the reason she had become a nurse in the first place. Long hours, difficult journeys, and lonely roads were simply part of the job. But standing alone in the freezing night was harder than she expected. Her hands trembled as she rubbed them together, trying to bring warmth back into her fingers. Snowflakes gathered on the edge of her bonnet and melted slowly against her skin. A distant howl echoed across the empty plains. Coyotes. Emily swallowed nervously and glanced around the deserted station yard. The wooden buildings nearby were dark, their windows shuttered against the storm. No lights glowed anywhere in town. For a moment she wondered if she should try walking to find shelter. But she had no idea where to go. Just as the thought crossed her mind, another sound carried through the wind. At first it was faint. A steady rhythm, hoofbeats. Emily turned toward the road leading from town. Through the swirling curtain of snow, a dark figure slowly emerged. A large horse pushed through the storm, its breath rising in clouds of steam. A rider sat tall in the saddle, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind and a heavy coat wrapped around his shoulders. The horse slowed as it approached the station platform. The rider studied the strange sight before him, a lone woman standing in the freezing snow. Emily's heart pounded slightly as the horse stopped only a few feet away. The man swung down from the saddle with easy strength, landing softly on the snow-covered ground. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and calm despite the storm raging around them. For a moment he said nothing, simply observing her with sharp, thoughtful eyes. Then his deep voice broke the silence. "You're gonna freeze out, here." Daniel's words hung in the cold air as snow drifted between them. Emily pulled the borrowed coat tighter around herself, still surprised by the stranger's sudden kindness. The thick fur lining held warmth she had not felt all night, and it slowly chased away the painful sting in her fingers. "I'm waiting for the morning train," she said again, though the explanation sounded weaker this time. Daniel glanced down the empty railroad tracks stretching into darkness, then up at the sky where the storm clouds thickened. "That train won't be running on time if this storm keeps up," he replied calmly. Emily looked away, realizing he might be right. The wind had grown stronger, and the snow was falling heavier by the minute. Daniel studied her more closely. Her cheeks were pale, and even with his coat wrapped around her, she was still trembling. "You traveling alone?" he asked. Emily nodded. "I'm on my way to the mining camp north of here." Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's nearly 40 miles. I know. In weather like this." She hesitated before answering, but honesty felt easier than trying to explain it away. "They asked for a nurse. A fever's spreading through the camp." For a moment Daniel said nothing. The wind pushed against his coat as he stood there considering her words. "You rode out here alone for that?" he asked. Emily gave a small nod. "People need help." Daniel looked back toward the road, then at his horse shifting patiently in the snow. The animal stamped its hooves and shook its mane, clearly eager to move. "Well," Daniel said finally, brushing snow from his gloves, "standing here isn't going to help anybody." Before Emily could question him, he stepped closer and gently took her small travel bag from her hands. "Hey, you can collect it later," he said calmly, tying the bag behind the saddle. Emily stared at him. "What are you doing?" "Getting you out of the cold." He placed one foot in the stirrup and adjusted the saddle blanket before turning back to her. "My ranch is about 30 minutes from here." Emily blinked in surprise. "Your ranch? Closest warm place around." The wind whistled loudly across the platform again, sending snow swirling around their feet. Emily hesitated. She had been taught to be careful with strangers, especially when traveling alone. The frontier was full of unpredictable people and stories that ended badly. But the man standing before her didn't seem dangerous. His voice was steady, his movements calm, and there was a quiet patience in his eyes that made her feel strangely safe. "You don't have to worry," Daniel added, noticing her uncertainty. "Got plenty of room, and a fire that's probably still burning." Emily looked out at the dark, frozen prairie surrounding the station. Staying here until morning suddenly seemed impossible. Finally she sighed softly. "All right," she said. Daniel nodded once, as if that settled the matter. He offered his hand. Emily placed her gloved fingers in his, surprised again by the warmth and strength of his grip. With a smooth motion, he lifted her onto the saddle as though she weighed nothing. A second later he swung up behind her, settling comfortably while gathering the reins. "You'll want to hold on," he said. Emily grasped the front of the saddle carefully. The horse stepped forward into the storm, snow crunching beneath its hooves as they left the lonely station behind. For several minutes they rode through darkness and wind. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, broken only by the faint outlines of fences and distant hills buried beneath snow. Emily could feel the warmth from Daniel behind her, steady and reassuring as he guided the horse confidently across the land. "You ride often?" he asked after a while. "Not like this," she admitted. A small chuckle rumbled from his chest. "You're doing just fine." Emily smiled faintly despite the storm. After nearly half an hour of riding, a glow finally appeared ahead through the snow. Lanterns. Several buildings slowly came into view, large barns, wooden fences, and a wide ranch house with light shining warmly from its windows. Emily stared in surprise. She had expected a small cabin. Instead, the ranch looked enormous. By the time Daniel and Emily reached the mining camp, the sky had turned pale gray with the early light of morning. The snowstorm had slowed during the night, leaving the ground covered in a thick blanket of white that stretched across the hills and narrow dirt roads. The small settlement looked even more fragile beneath the cold winter sky. Rough wooden buildings stood close together, their chimneys releasing thin streams of smoke into the frozen air. A few miners moved slowly through the streets, their faces tired and worried. When they noticed the approaching wagons and riders, several of them stopped and stared. Emily felt her heart tighten. The place looked worse than she had imagined. Daniel guided his horse toward the small clinic near the center of the camp. The building was barely larger than a cabin, with a faded sign hanging above the door. Outside, a man wearing a heavy coat stood waiting anxiously, as if he had been watching the road for hours. When he saw Emily climb down from the horse, relief immediately crossed his face. "You made it," he said, hurrying toward her. "You must be Dr. Harris," Emily replied, recognizing him from the letter he had sent. He nodded quickly. "And thank heaven you came. We're nearly out of supplies, and half the camp is sick." Before Emily could answer, the sound of wagons rolling into the camp drew everyone's attention. Several large supply wagons followed behind Daniel, loaded with crates, blankets, and barrels. Ranch hands jumped down and began unloading the cargo. Dr. Harris stared in disbelief. Where did all this come from? Emily turned and looked at Daniel, who had just dismounted and was calmly giving instructions to the men. "He brought it," she said softly. Within minutes the quiet camp transformed into organized movement. Blankets were distributed to families, food was carried into homes, and crates of medicine were delivered directly into the clinic. Emily wasted no time getting to work. Inside the small building, several patients lay on narrow beds, their faces pale and exhausted from fever. She moved from one to another, checking temperatures, preparing medicine, and speaking gently to calm frightened children. Outside, Daniel helped organize shelters for those too weak to work. Fires were built, warm soup was prepared, and extra beds were brought from the wagons. The ranch hands worked tirelessly alongside the miners, following Daniel's quiet but steady leadership. For 2 days and nights, the work barely stopped. Emily slept only a few hours between caring for patients. Daniel often remained nearby, bringing hot coffee, supplies, or simply making sure everything ran smoothly. Slowly, the fever began to loosen its grip on the camp. One morning, as the sun rose over the snowy hills, Dr. Harris stepped outside the clinic with a tired but hopeful smile. "I think we've turned the corner," he said. Daniel leaned against the porch railing, looking toward the quiet town. "Good," he replied. Emily stepped out beside them, brushing loose strands of hair from her face. She looked exhausted but relieved. Families had begun stepping outside their homes again, children playing in the snow as though the dark days had already begun to fade. Dr. Harris looked at Daniel thoughtfully. "You didn't just save supplies," he said. "You saved this entire camp." Daniel shook his head slightly. "She did," he said, nodding toward Emily. Emily smiled softly, but her eyes carried gratitude. If Daniel hadn't ridden past that freezing train station on the stormiest night of the winter, she might never have made it here. And the outcome could have been very different. Years later, people across the territory would still tell the story of the nurse who braved a blizzard to help strangers, and the millionaire cowboy who turned one small act of kindness into something that saved an entire town. Cowboy Hat Face.